Two bobcats were found freezing in a snowstorm. One was pregnant. Look who came to the rescue. The fire had burned low in the cast-iron stove, and Henry Thompson leaned forward in his chair to add another split log to the dying embers. The wood caught quickly, sending up a shower of sparks that danced behind the glass door before settling into a steady flame. He watched them with the patient attention of a man who had nowhere else to be. No one waiting for him to come to bed. No voice calling from the kitchen to ask if he wanted another cup of coffee. 3 winters had passed since Eleanor's hands last tended this fire, since her voice filled these rooms with warmth that no amount of burning wood could replicate. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the windows with a fury that made the old farmhouse groan in its joints. Snow drove sideways past the porch light, creating a tunnel of swirling white that disappeared into absolute darkness beyond. The wind had teeth tonight, Henry thought, grinding and gnashing at anything foolish enough to stand against it. He pulled the wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. One Eleanor had knitted during their first winter here, 43 years ago, when they were young and thought Montana winters were romantic adventures rather than tests of endurance. The horses would need checking. The thought came to him unbidden, the way responsibilities do. When you've lived with them so long, they become part of your breathing. Henry glanced at the clock on the mantel just past 9. The stable was solid, built by his own hands, with help from neighbors long since moved away or buried in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church in town. Still, on nights like this, he couldn't rest easy without seeing for himself that the animals were secure. He stood with the careful deliberation of his 71 years, joints protesting the movement after sitting too long. The coat hanging by the door was heavy with years of use, its canvas exterior stained and patched but still serviceable. As he shrugged into it, Henry caught himself listening for Eleanor's voice, the way she always reminded him to take a flashlight, to wear his scarf, to be careful of ice on the porch steps. The silence that answered him was so complete it seemed to have weight. The moment he opened the door, the wind tried to tear it from his hands. Snow stung his face like tiny needles, and the cold hit his lungs with a shock that made him gasp. Henry pulled his collar up and bent his head into the storm, following the rope he'd strung between the house and the stable for nights, just like this one. His boots crunched through the fresh powder that had already obliterated the path he'd shoveled that afternoon. Inside the stable, the world quieted to a more manageable roar. The horses stood placidly in their stalls, breath steaming in the cold air but otherwise untroubled. Buttercup, his old mare, nickered softly when she saw him, and he spent a moment stroking her neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath her winter coat. The other 3 horses barely looked up from their hay. Accustomed to his late-night visits during storms, Henry was checking the water buckets, making sure none had frozen over. When he heard it, something that wasn't wind. It wasn't the creak of old timber adjusting to the cold. The sound was faint, almost lost in the storm's chaos. But his ears had learned over decades of rural life to pick out what didn't belong. It came again, weak and broken, like something trying to call out but lacking the strength to complete the effort. He stood perfectly still, the flashlight beam steady on the far wall, and listened. There from outside, from the direction of the old equipment shed, Henry had been meaning to tear that shed down for years, but somehow never got around to it. Now its weathered boards provided just enough windbreak that something had sought shelter there. The journey to the shed was only 30 yards, but the wind made every step a battle. Snow had drifted against the lee side of the building, creating a hollow where the wind couldn't quite reach. Henry's flashlight beam swept across the drift, then stopped. His breath caught in his throat. 2 bobcats huddled together in the wind shadow, their fur crystallized with ice, bodies trembling with violent shivers that seemed to consume what little energy they had left. The larger one, a male by the look of him, had positioned himself on the windward side, using his body as a shield for his companion. Even in the harsh beam of the flashlight, Henry could see the male's strength was nearly gone. Ice had formed around his eyes and muzzle, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. But it was the female that made Henry's decision for him. Her belly was visibly swollen with pregnancy, and when she lifted her head to look at him, her golden eyes held something that transcended the boundary between wild animal and human understanding. It wasn't quite a plea, wild things don't beg, but rather an acknowledgement of desperate circumstance. A recognition that death waited just beyond the next hour. If something didn't change, Henry had lived long enough to know that some moments demand action without calculation. Compassion without consideration of consequence. He dropped to his knees in the snow, his voice falling into the low, steady tone he used with spooked horses. "Easy now," he said, though the wind tried to steal the words. "Easy. I won't harm you." The female made a sound then, barely more than a whisper of what should have been a snarl or cry. The male tried to raise his head in warning, but couldn't manage more than a few inches before it dropped back to the snow. They were dying. Henry realized, perhaps minutes away from the point where cold would claim them entirely. Moving slowly, he unzipped his coat halfway and wrapped the female in one side of it, lifting her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had already stolen half her substance. The male was heavier but so weak that when Henry gathered him up with his free arm, there was only a moment's feeble resistance before the animal went limp, surrendering to whatever fate this strange two-legged creature might bring. The walk back to the house was the longest of Henry's life. The wind fought him for every step, trying to tear the animals from his arms, driving snow into his face until he could barely see. The male bobcat's head lolled against his shoulder, and for a terrible moment, Henry thought he'd already lost him. But then he felt the faint rise and fall of breathing, the tiny thread of warmth that meant life still persisted. Inside, Henry laid them on the thick rug before the fireplace, careful to keep them at a distance from the direct heat. He knew from winters of tending livestock that warming had to happen gradually, that too much too fast could be as deadly as the cold itself. The bobcats lay where he placed them, barely conscious, their breathing shallow and irregular. The phone was in his hand before he fully thought about what to do next. The conservation office in Billings had a 24-hour emergency line, and within moments he was connected to Dr. Emily Parker, the wildlife veterinarian. Her voice was calm and professional as Henry described what he'd found, what he'd done. "You did right bringing them in," she said. "They wouldn't have lasted another hour. Warm them gradually, just like you're doing, if they can lap. Offer water from a spoon or shallow dish. Don't try to feed them yet. Their systems need to stabilize first. Keep the room as dark and quiet as possible." She paused, then added with careful emphasis, "Mr. Thompson, these are wild animals. Even in their weakened state, they can be dangerous if they feel threatened. Please be extremely careful." Henry looked at the two forms on his rug, so still they might have been fur coats dropped carelessly on the floor. "I understand," he said quietly, "but right now, they're just cold." After hanging up, Henry filled a shallow bowl with lukewarm water and set it between the bobcats. The male Henry had already started thinking of him as Rusty, for the reddish tinge to his fur didn't move. But the female lifted her head slightly, nostrils flaring as she scented the water. With enormous effort, she dragged herself forward a few inches and began to lap weakly at the bowl. Henry pulled Eleanor's rocking chair closer to the fire and settled in to watch. The female willow, he decided, for her gray-brown coloring drank a little, then collapsed back onto the rug. But after a few minutes, Rusty stirred, golden eyes opening to slits. When he saw Henry watching, his lips pulled back slightly, revealing formidable canines in what should have been a snarl but came out as barely a grimace. "I know," Henry said softly. "I'm not your first choice of savior, but we're all we've got tonight." The hours that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Henry dozed in the chair, waking every time one of the animals moved or made a sound. He kept the fire steady, not too hot, and refreshed the water when they emptied it. Sometime around midnight, Willow began to pant heavily, her sides heaving with something more than just the effort of breathing. Henry called Dr. Parker again. "She's going into labor," the vet confirmed after hearing his description. "This changes things considerably. Keep your distance as much as possible, but have clean towels ready in case she needs help. The male might become protective if he shows any aggression. Leave the room immediately." But Rusty, far from becoming aggressive, seemed to understand that their survival now depended on this strange creature who had pulled them from the snow. When Henry approached with towels, The male bobcat watched him intently, but made no move to interfere. There was intelligence in those golden eyes, a calculation of odds and necessities that resulted in cautious acceptance. The first kitten arrived just after 1 in the morning. Henry watched from his chair as Willow's body convulsed with effort, as the tiny form emerged wet and motionless onto the rug. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then Willow bent to lick the kitten vigorously, and suddenly there was movement. A tiny cry that sounded like the very definition of life, asserting itself against all odds. Rusty dragged himself closer to inspect the newborn, sniffing it carefully before looking up at Henry with an expression that could only be described as wonder mixed with gratitude. When the second kitten arrived 20 minutes later, the male was ready, adding his rough tongue to Willow's in, cleaning the newborn and stimulating it to breathe. By dawn, 5 kittens lay in a squirming pile against Willow's belly, their cries thin but insistent as they searched for milk. The storm had begun to ease, and pale light filtered through the windows to illuminate a scene that belonged in no Montana living room, but had happened there nonetheless. Henry had named them all in his mind as they arrived: Snow for the white-pawed firstborn, Ash for the gray male, Maple for the one with the reddish stripe, River for the smallest who'd needed extra help to start breathing, and Dawn for the last, who arrived just as the sky began to lighten. Exhaustion weighed on Henry like a physical thing, but he couldn't look away from the family on his rug. Rusty had positioned himself as a barrier between the kittens and the larger world, but his eyes remained on Henry, watchful but no longer hostile. When Henry slowly reached for the water bowl to refill it, Rusty's paw moved slightly, not quite touching Henry's hand, but acknowledging it, like a covenant sealed without words. The knock at the door came just after 7, sharp and official in the morning quiet. Doctor. Emily Parker stood on the porch with 2 assistants, their truck idling in the driveway, exhaust creating clouds in the cold air. She was younger than Henry had expected from her voice, perhaps 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident movements of someone comfortable with unpredictable animals. "Mr. Thompson," she said, stepping inside and immediately focusing on the scene by the fireplace. "Oh my." She knelt at a respectful distance from the Bobcat family, her trained eye taking in details Henry hadn't noticed. Her expression shifted from professional interest to something more complex: surprise, then concern. She leaned closer, examining Rusty's ear, then Willow's. "These aren't wild bobcats," she said quietly. "See the tattoos in their ears. These animals were bred in captivity, probably sold illegally as exotic pets, then abandoned when they became too difficult to manage." Her voice carried a controlled anger. "Releasing captive-bred predators is not just illegal. It's a death sentence. They don't have the skills to survive in the wild, especially not in winter, especially not with a pregnant female." Henry felt his own anger rise, hot and sudden. What kind of person would do such a thing, to raise wild creatures in captivity, let them depend on humans for survival, then throw them out to die in a Montana winter? "What happens to them now?" he asked. "Doctor." Parker was already directing her assistants to bring in the transport cages. "First, we get them to our facility for medical evaluation and care. They'll need to be quarantined and monitored. After that," she paused, considering, "they can't be released. They don't know how to hunt, how to establish territory, how to avoid humans. But there's a wildlife education center in Billings that might take them. They have proper facilities, outdoor enclosures with heated dens, rocks and trees for climbing, proper nutrition programs. It's not the wild, but it's a good life. Safe." The team worked with practiced efficiency, transferring Willow and her kittens to one carrier, Rusty to another, positioned where the mates could see and smell each other. Throughout the process, the Bobcats remained calm, as if understanding that these humans, like the old one who'd saved them, meant no harm. As they prepared to leave, Henry remembered something. "Wait," he said, hurrying to the bedroom. He returned with the quilt Eleanor had made during their first year of marriage, the one with the wedding ring pattern that had covered their bed for decades. "For the kittens," he said, offering it to Dr. Place. "Parker, it has the smell of safety on it, of home." The vet took the quilt gently, understanding the magnitude of the gift. I'll make sure it stays with them, she promised. Mr. Thompson, you saved 7 lives last night. 6 bobcats and oat. She paused, in studying his face. And maybe one more. Sometimes saving something else is how we save ourselves. After they left, the house felt impossibly empty. Henry stood in his living room, looking at the depression in the rug where Willow had delivered her kittens. At the water bowl, still sitting by the fireplace. The space felt larger somehow, as if the bobcats had taken something with them. Or perhaps had left something behind, he couldn't tell which. Days blurred into weeks. Dr. Parker called regularly with updates, and then began sending photos. Henry would drive to the library in town to print them out, bringing them home to pin on the refrigerator with magnets Eleanor had collected from their travels. Yellowstone, Glacier, the Badlands. In the pictures, he watched the kittens' eyes open, watched them begin to explore their quarantine enclosure, watched Rusty regain his strength and natural grace. The invitation came in May, written on the Wildlife Center's official letterhead. Would Mr. Happen Thompson like to visit the Bobcat family in their new home? Henry put on his best shirt, the one Eleanor always said brought out the blue in his eyes, and drove the 2 hours to Billings with a nervousness he hadn't felt since their first date. The education center was impressive, spacious enclosures designed to look natural while providing all necessary care. When he arrived at the Bobcat habitat, Rusty saw him first. The male had filled out, his coat glossy with health, muscles rippling as he padded to the viewing window. Willow emerged from the constructed den, and behind her, one by one, came 5 half-grown bobcats, all legs and oversized paws, their spotted coats bright in the spring sunshine. Henry placed his palm against the glass. Without hesitation, Rusty placed his paw on the other side, matching the position exactly. One of the kittens, Snow, Henry was certain. Recognizing the white paws, bounded over and added both front paws to the glass, standing on hind legs to reach higher. For a long moment, 3 heartbeats synchronized across the barrier between wild and civilized, between saved and savior. They remember you, said a voice beside him. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9, stood watching with serious eyes. The lady said they were rescued from the snow by a brave man. Was that you? Henry nodded, not trusting his voice. The girl held out a piece of paper, a crayon drawing of bobcats in the snow and a figure in a big coat carrying them. I made this for you, she said, so you can remember being brave. He took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. Thank you, he managed. But I wasn't brave. I was just there when they needed someone. That's what brave is, the girl said matter-of-factly, then ran off to rejoin her class. Henry visited monthly through the summer and fall. Each time, Rusty would appear at the glass, followed by his family. The kittens grew into young adults, developing distinct personalities Henry could recognize even from a distance. Snow was bold and curious, always the first to investigate anything new. Ash was cautious like his father, watching and calculating before acting. Maple was playful, pouncing on leaves and chasing shadows. River remained the smallest, but was perhaps the most intelligent, figuring out puzzle feeders faster than his siblings. And Dawn was gentle, often grooming the others, maintaining the family bonds with patient attention. Linda and his daughter called more frequently now. Their conversations had deepened since that winter night, as if saving the bobcats had opened something in Henry that had been closed since Eleanor's death. Are you happy, Dad? She asked during one evening call. Henry considered the question, looking around his living room. The new rug didn't show any trace of that desperate night, but he knew exactly where Willow had lain, where the kittens had taken their first breaths. The fire crackled in the stove, and outside, the first snow of another winter was beginning to fall. I'm not happy exactly, he said carefully. Your mother is still gone, and that won't change. But I'm engaged again. With life, I mean, that night with the bobcats. It reminded me that being needed doesn't end just because we get old or alone. There's always something or someone who needs what we can give. even if it's just warmth on a cold night. Mom would have loved that story, Linda said softly. She would have. Henry agreed. She would have been right there with me, heating towels and probably singing to them. You know how she was with anything hurt or scared. I remember. Linda said, Dad, I'm proud of you. After the call, Henry sat by the fire, working on a letter to Dr. Parker. The Wildlife Center was fundraising to build larger enclosures, to expand their education programs. Henry had decided to donate a significant portion of his savings money he and Eleanor had set aside for travels they'd never take. The Bobcats had given him something worth more than any trip purpose. Connection. The knowledge that love doesn't end with loss but transforms. Finding new vessels. New expressions. Winter deepened, and the storms came as they always did in Montana. On the worst nights, when the wind howled and snow piled against the windows, Henry would stand by the glass and peer out into the darkness. Sometimes he imagined he could hear Willow calling to her young, could see the shadow of Rusty standing guard. He knew they were safe in Billings, warm in their heated den, but part of them remained here too, in the space between wild and tame, between loss and renewal. 3 years passed. The bobcat kittens were fully grown, and 2 of the females had been transferred to other facilities to start conservation breeding programs. Snow, Ash, and River remained with their parents, and the Wildlife Center had built a new Graston, larger enclosure with Dr. Fine, Parker's fundraising, and Henry's donation. The grand opening was scheduled for a warm September day, and Henry was invited as an honored guest. The new habitat was magnificent, nearly 2 acres of natural Montana landscape, safely enclosed but spacious enough for the bobcats to run, climb, hunt with provided prey, and live as naturally as captive-bred animals could. There was even a heated indoor area with viewing windows for educational programs during winter. The ceremony was brief but moving. Dr. Parker spoke about the importance of wildlife conservation, about the responsibilities humans bear when they choose to keep wild animals. She told the story of a winter night, an old man, and a desperate rescue that had become something larger, a symbol of compassion transcending species, of life preserving life. When they opened the access tunnel from the old enclosure to the new habitat, Rusty emerged first, as Henry had known he would. The big male padded cautiously into the space, testing the air, examining the boundaries. Willow followed, and then their 3 remaining offspring, now indistinguishable from wild bobcats, except for the small tattoos in their ears and their comfort with human proximity. The family explored their new territory, methodically, Rusty establishing perimeter markers, Willow investigating the den sites, the young adults testing the climbing structures and discovering the stream that ran through one corner of the enclosure. Watching them, Henry felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't the wild, but it was good. It was enough. As the crowd dispersed, Henry remained by the fence, watching. Rusty, finished with his initial exploration, approached the fence line where Henry stood. The bobcat sat on his haunches and looked directly at the old man, gold eyes meeting blue across the divide of species and circumstance. Thank you for trusting me that night, Henry said quietly. Rusty tilted his head slightly, and then did something Henry had seen only once before. He gave a slow, deliberate blink, the feline expression of trust and affection. Then he turned and padded back to his family, to Willow grooming herself in a patch of sunshine, to their sons lounging on warm rocks. Driving home that evening, Henry thought about circles and cycles, about endings that become beginnings. The sun was setting over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of Eleanor's favorite sunset, and the one they'd watched from their porch the night before. She went into the hospital for the last time, back home, and he built up the fire and settled into his chair with a cup of coffee. On the mantel sat a framed photo. Dr. Parker had taken Henry with his hand on the glass, Rusty's paw meeting it from the other side. The whole bobcat family visible in the background. Next to it stood Eleanor's picture from their 40th anniversary, her smile as warm as summer sunshine. We did good, didn't we? Ellie, he said to the photo. We kept the flame burning. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with familiar insistence. But inside, the fire crackled cheerfully, and the house felt full of presence, memories of Eleanor, echoes of that desperate winter night, the continuing connection to 7 lives saved and salvaged. Henry had learned that grief was not something to be conquered, but integrated, woven into the fabric of continuing life, like threads in one of Eleanor's quilts. The phone rang. Linda, calling to say she and the grandkids would visit next weekend. After the call, Henry stood by the window, looking out at the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, wild bobcats hunted and raised their young as they had for millennia. Somewhere in Billings, in his bobcats, he would always think of them as his, were settling into their evening routines, safe and warm. He had become, he realized, a keeper of flames, the literal fire in his stove, the flame of his love for Eleanor that would burn until his last day, and the flame of life he'd sheltered that winter night when 2 dying bobcats had trusted him with their survival and their young. Each flame supported the others, creating a warmth that filled the old farmhouse and pushed back against the cold darkness of loss and loneliness. As he prepared for bed, Henry paused at the door to check the lock, a habit of decades. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of movement, a trick of shadow and snow. Perhaps, but for just a moment, he could swear he saw a bobcat's silhouette against the barn wall. He smiled, knowing it was impossible but choosing to accept the benediction anyway. "Good night, Rusty," he said softly. "Take care of the family." The wind answered with a sound that might have been acknowledgement, might have been simply Montana winter, speaking its ancient language. Henry turned away from the door and headed to bed, carrying with him the warmth of connection that transcended species, time, and even death itself. In saving the bobcats, they had saved him in return, teaching him that love doesn't diminish when given but multiplies, creating new channels for its expression, new reasons to tend the fire and keep the flame alive. The story of the bobcats would be told in the town for years to come, growing and changing with each telling. But for Henry, it would always be simple on the coldest night of winter. Love had walked on 4 legs into his life and reminded him that as long as there was something to care for, someone to help, a flame to tend, life was worth living fully and well. In the bedroom that had been too empty for too long, Henry pulled up Eleanor's quilt, not the one with the bobcats now, but another she'd made, covered in representations of Montana wildflowers. As sleep took him, he thought he heard, very faintly, the sound of purring. Whether it was memory, imagination, or something more mysterious, didn't matter. What mattered was that the house was no longer empty. The flame was still burning, and tomorrow would bring another day of purpose and connection. The last thing he murmured before sleep claimed him was, "Thank you, Willow. Thank you, Rusty. Thank you for reminding me how to live."